"Ma'am, I need you to step aside." The clerk was already reaching for the phone, bored, unbothered, watching a young mother's card get declined for the third time while her infant screamed against her shoulder. I was 2 people back in line at a gas station market in Port Calloway, close enough to see the young woman's hands shaking, close enough to smell that she hadn't showered in days. Then she turned her face toward the register light, and my coffee cup hit the floor. I was looking at my own daughter. The daughter I'd been told for 3 months was resting comfortably at a wellness retreat 2,000 miles away. Before we go any further, thank you so much for being here. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and it truly means the world to me. A quick note: this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and meaningful storytelling. Names and settings are coincidental, but what it has to say, that part is worth holding on to. I didn't call out her name. I didn't rush the counter. I stood perfectly still for what felt like a full minute, watching my granddaughter's face turn red with crying, watching my daughter count loose bills from her coat pocket with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and I understood in that single frozen moment that everything I'd been told for the last 11 weeks had been a lie, and that whoever had built that lie had badly underestimated exactly what kind of woman they were dealing with. I stepped forward, reached past her shoulder, and set my own card down on the counter before the clerk could say another word. My daughter turned, saw my face, and the sound she made didn't belong to a grown woman at all. It would take me 3 days to learn how long she'd actually been gone, and 11 weeks to understand exactly who'd taken her. But that first night, sitting in the passenger seat of my own rental car while Grace and the baby slept in the back, wrapped in every blanket the hotel down the road had been willing to spare, I didn't need 3 days to understand one thing clearly. I had let this happen. Not by any single decision, but by 100 small ones, each of them dressed up as respect. It started in June, the way most disasters do. Quietly, in a phone call I nearly let go to voicemail because I was in a board meeting. Nathaniel's name on the screen wasn't unusual. He called often enough in those early months after Nora was born, always pleasant, always a little too smooth in the way certain men raised around money learn to be. "Maggie," he'd said, "Grace has been struggling more than we expected. Postpartum anxiety, the doctors think, on top of the exhaustion. Mother's arranged for her to stay at a wellness facility in Colorado. Very private, very well regarded, the kind of place that specializes in this exact thing. We just think it's best if she has some quiet, uninterrupted time." I remember exactly what I said back, because I've turned it over in my head every night since. I said, "Of course. Whatever she needs." I didn't ask the name of the facility. I didn't ask which doctor had made the diagnosis. I didn't ask to speak to my own daughter directly because some old instinct in me, the same instinct that had built a shipping company out of a single lease tugboat by staying out of other people's business until the numbers demanded otherwise, told me that pushing too hard too fast would look like exactly the kind of overbearing mother I'd promised myself years ago I would never become. Grace had married into money the year before, and I'd been careful, deliberately careful, not to hover. Corinne Cavanaugh ran her family's holdings with a precision I recognized and respected, the two of us circling each other politely at every function for 18 months like women who understood exactly how much power the other held and had no interest in testing it directly. I told myself giving Grace room to build her own marriage, her own life, separate from her mother's constant oversight, was a gift. I told myself that for 11 weeks. The texts when they came should have told me everything. Grace used to text the way she'd always talked. Fast, funny, 3 exclamation points where one would do. Somewhere around the 2nd week of her retreat, the messages changed. Order. Flatter. Doing better. Miss you. Talk soon. No mention of Nora by name, which struck me as odd even then, though I let myself believe exhaustion simply didn't leave room for detail. When I suggested flying out to visit, just for a day, just to see her, the reply came 4 hours later instead of the usual few minutes. "Not yet, Mom. Doctors say I need to focus inward right now. Soon, I promise." I read that message on my patio at Egret Point with a glass of wine I didn't finish, and some small, stubborn part of me, the part that had spent 3 decades reading balance sheets for the sentence that didn't add up, noticed something wrong in the rhythm of it. Grace had never in her life called anything focusing inward. That was Corinne's language, not my daughter's. I noticed it, and then I did what I had trained myself to do for 18 months. I let it go because the alternative was admitting I didn't fully trust the people my daughter had chosen to build a life with, and admitting that felt, at the time, like a failure of my own. Nathaniel called twice more over the following weeks, each time with an update so smooth and reasonable it left no obvious thread to pull. Grace was improving, the doctors were pleased. She'd asked that calls be kept minimal while she focused on recovery. I believed every word of it, right up until 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in Port Callaway, standing in a fluorescent-lit market 3 states away from Colorado, watching my daughter's card get declined for baby formula she was buying with loose change from her coat pocket. There is no wellness retreat in Colorado. There never was. I would learn that clearly enough within the hour, once Grace could finally speak in full sentences again instead of gasping apologies into my shoulder in the parking lot. But sitting there that first night, watching her sleep in the back seat with Nora curled against her chest, what I kept returning to wasn't Nathaniel's lies, or Corinne's precision, or even the 26 days I'd later learn my daughter had spent somewhere I hadn't thought to look. What I kept returning to was every quiet, reasonable choice I'd made not to ask harder questions, and how completely, catastrophically wrong that instinct had turned out to be. We reached Egret Point a little after 2 in the morning, and Franny Callahan was already standing in the lit doorway before I'd even brought the car to a full stop in the drive. I'd called her from the road, given her almost nothing beyond, Grace is with me, and she needs a warm room and formula for a baby, and Franny, who has run that house for 19 years and asks fewer questions than anyone I have ever trusted with anything important, had simply gotten it done. There was a bassinet made up from the guest room's daybed with folded towels for bumpers. There was formula correctly mixed, warmed to the right temperature, because Franny had raised 4 children of her own and hadn't forgotten a single thing about doing it right. There was soup on the stove at 2 in the morning, as though she'd simply known. Grace ate sitting at the kitchen island with Nora finally, blessedly, asleep against her shoulder, and I watched my daughter's hands shake less with every spoonful, the way you'd watch color slowly return to something that had gone pale from cold. I didn't ask her anything that first hour. I had learned, over 11 weeks of asking too little, that I could stand to wait a little longer to ask the right way. It was nearly 4 in the morning when she finally spoke on her own, staring down into an empty bowl rather than at me. "It wasn't Colorado," she said. "There's no wellness retreat, Mom. There's a cottage. On the back of the Kavanaugh property, out past the boathouse, on a little dirt road they call Marsh Row because it used to lead down to the old rice fields." I kept my voice level, the way I'd learned to keep it level in 30 years of board meetings when the numbers in front of me were far worse than anyone in the room wanted to say out loud. "Tell me," I said. She told me it had started with a fight. A small one, she thought at the time, about whether she was handling motherhood, the way Corinne expected a Kavanaugh wife to handle it, about whether the crying and the sleeplessness and the fear she couldn't quite name yet were signs of something Corinne called instability, in a tone Grace said made her feel, even then, like she was being diagnosed rather than comforted. Within a week of that conversation, Nathaniel had suggested she rest somewhere quieter while things settled. Within 2 weeks, quieter had become the cottage, a guest structure on the property that had once housed groundskeepers decades earlier and had sat empty and half-gutted for years since, mid-renovation, walls open to insulation in places, one working outlet in the whole building. "They told me it was temporary," Grace said. "A few days until I felt more like myself." Nathaniel drove me out there himself the first night, carried Nora's things in, said he'd be back the next morning to check on us. Her voice didn't break on that part, which somehow made it worse to hear than if it had. He didn't come back the next morning. He came back 4 days later, with groceries and no explanation, and by then I understood I wasn't supposed to ask when I was coming home. 26 days in total, though she said the days themselves had blurred together fast, the way exhaustion does that to time. No working heat, So she'd slept with Nora tucked against her chest under every blanket she could find, waking every 2 hours from cold as much as from feeding. No phone. Nathaniel had taken it the second week, telling her the screen time was part of what was making her anxiety worse. A phrase I recognized instantly as Corinne's, the same clinical distance she'd used on me in every conversation we'd ever had. No money beyond what Nathaniel occasionally left with the groceries. Never enough, never explained. And Nora, all 26 days, wouldn't stop crying the way a healthy baby cries when she's simply hungry or tired. It was a different sound, Grace said, thinner and more effortful, a sound that made her chest ache with a fear she had no doctor to bring it to, because by the third week she understood clearly that no one was coming to take her to one. "I got out 4 days ago," she finally said. Nathaniel left the cottage unlocked when he came with groceries, and I don't think he even considered that I'd try to walk anywhere, because where would I go, with no phone and no car and nothing in my name anymore? I walked to the market because it was the only lit building I could see from the road, and I was going to ask anyone to let me use a phone. And then you were just standing there. I reached across the kitchen island and took her hand, the same hand that had shaken counting loose change 11 hours earlier, and I made her a promise I intended entirely to keep. "You are never going back there," I told her. "And I am going to find out exactly who did this to you, and I am going to make certain they answer for every single day of it." By 6 that morning, Franny had turned the guest wing at Egret Point into something closer to a small, quiet hospital ward than a bedroom, a humidifier running low in the corner, a stack of clean towels warmed on the radiator, a pediatric thermometer she'd apparently driven into town at 4 in the morning to buy from the one 24-hour pharmacy that stocked one, though she never once asked my permission or waited for instruction to do any of it. I found her at 7, sitting in the rocking chair by the window with Nora against her shoulder so Grace could finally sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch, humming something low and tuneless that I recognized, after a moment, as the same thing she used to hum to Grace herself, 30 years earlier in this same house. "Go do whatever it is you're about to go do," Franny told me without looking up. "I raised 4 of my own through fevers and colic and worse. I've got this. You've got something else to handle. And you've had that look on your face since you walked in the door." She was right, of course. Franny is usually right, which is the entire reason I have trusted her with the 2 things I love most for 19 years without a single hesitation. I went down to my study while the house was still quiet, sat behind my father's old desk, the one piece of furniture from the original tugboat office I'd never let myself replace, and I made myself sit still for exactly 1 minute before I picked up the phone, because I have learned across 3 decades of business that the first instinct in a crisis is rarely the wisest one, only the loudest. My first instinct was to call a lawyer and threaten every Kavanaugh within reach. My second, calmer instinct, the one I trusted, was to call Callum Reed. Callum had run corporate security and investigations for Doyle Maritime for 11 years before he retired, and in all that time I'd never once seen him move faster than the situation required, or slower either. A rare quality in a man whose entire career depended on knowing exactly how much urgency a piece of information deserved. He picked up on the second ring, gravel-voiced and unbothered by the early hour, the way retired men who've spent their careers on other people's emergencies tend to be. "Maggie Doyle," he said. "It's not even 7. Either the company's on fire, or something's happened that matters more than the company." The second one, I told him, and then I told him everything. The market in Port Calloway, the declined card, the cottage on Marsh Road, 26 days with no phone and no money, and a baby who cried like something was wrong with her. I told him about the wellness retreat story, and about the strange, clinical flatness that had crept into Grace's rare messages over 11 weeks. Callum listened without interrupting once, which I had always appreciated about him and appreciated more than ever in that moment, because I needed to say all of it out loud in order, before I could think clearly about any of it. When I finished, he was quiet a moment. "I want 3 things, he finally said. "I want everything you can pull on Nathaniel Kavanaugh's financial activity over the last 12 months. Anything that's touched Grace's name, her accounts, anything with your company's stock in it. I want to know who's been managing Grace's shares in Doyle Maritime since the wedding, because inherited stock in a company this size doesn't sit quiet for 18 months without somebody paying close attention to it. And I want 48 hours before you say a single word to anyone else, including your own legal counsel, because until I know how deep this goes, I don't know yet who else might already be compromised. That last part landed harder than I expected it to. You think this is about the company? I think, Callum said carefully, that a family with the Kavanagh's resources doesn't need to isolate a young mother in a gutted cottage for 26 days over a marital dispute. People with real money handle marital disputes with lawyers and separate houses. Maggie, not by cutting off her phone. That kind of control is either about fear or it's about leverage. Given what your granddaughter's stock represents, I'd start with leverage and work backward from there. I sat with that a long while after we hung up, looking out my study window at the marsh grass just beginning to catch the early light, and I thought about Grace's inherited shares, 11% of Doyle Maritime, held in a trust that had transferred fully into her name the day she turned 28, 6 months before her wedding. I had never once worried about that stock. I had trusted, the way I'd trusted everything else about Nathaniel and his family for 18 months, that it simply sat quietly in the background of my daughter's new life, unremarkable, unwatched. I no longer believed that. And I intended to know exactly how wrong I'd been by the end of the day. Grace slept most of that first full day at Egret Point, and I let her, though I sat in the chair by her window more than once just to watch her breathe steadily for a few minutes at a time, the way I used to check on her as a child during bad fevers. It was evening before she woke fully rested enough to talk, Nora fed and drowsy in the bassinet beside the bed, and she asked me quietly if I wanted to hear the rest of it now or wait until morning. Now, I told her. If you're able. She sat up against the headboard, pulled her knees to her chest the way she used to as a teenager working up to a confession, and started, unexpectedly, not with the cottage but with the wedding itself, or rather the months just after it, when she said everything had still felt, on the surface, like the life she'd wanted. It didn't happen all at once, Mom. That's what I keep trying to make people understand, except there's been no one to tell until now. If Nathaniel had tried to take everything from me in a week, I would have left. Anyone would have left. But it was so slow I never once felt the ground actually move. It started, she said, with her phone. Not confiscated, not at first, just gradually replaced. Nathaniel had insisted, gently, reasonably, on a family plan that put both their phones under his account within the first 2 months of the marriage, the kind of thing plenty of couples do without a second thought. Then came a new phone for her birthday, nicer than her old one, already set up with new accounts, new passwords he'd saved for her convenience, in a notes app she never thought to question. She didn't notice for a long while that every login for every account she used now ran through credentials Nathaniel technically had access to as well. The bank accounts went the same slow way. A joint account first, sensible enough for a married couple, and then, over months, the gradual redirection of her own small consulting income into that joint account rather than the private one she'd kept since college, until one day she went looking for that old account and found it had been closed, for consolidation. A decision she was told she'd agreed to during a conversation she genuinely didn't remember having, though by then, she said, she'd started to doubt her own memory often enough, that she simply accepted it. That's the part one still can't fully explain, she told me, and her voice caught here for the first time since she'd started talking. Somewhere in there I stopped trusting myself before I stopped trusting him. Every time something felt wrong, Corinne would say something like, "Grace, sweetheart, are you sure you remember that correctly? You've seemed so overwhelmed lately." And I'd think, maybe I am overwhelmed. Maybe I am misremembering things. New mothers forget things, don't they? I let her convince me the problem was my own mind long before I ever considered the problem might be the two of them. The friendships went last, and this was the part that made my hands curl into fists at my sides, quiet and controlled, the way I've learned to be angry in boardrooms without ever raising my voice. Corinne had started small there too, gentle suggestions that certain friends of Grace's weren't really Kavanaugh people. Polite exclusions from family events that made those friendships feel, slowly, like more trouble than they were worth to maintain. Nathaniel had discouraged visits home to Egret Point with a dozen reasonable-sounding excuses, always tied to Grace's health, her anxiety, her need for calm. By the time Nora was born, Grace said, she genuinely couldn't think of a single person outside the Kavanaugh household she could call without feeling like she'd be causing some kind of disloyalty. That's when the postpartum anxiety talk started, she said. Because by then, I actually was anxious, Mom. I actually wasn't sleeping, I actually was scared all the time, except it wasn't some chemical imbalance. It was that I'd looked up one day and realized I didn't have a single person left in my life who wasn't already loyal to them first. I didn't say anything for a long moment after she finished, because I was afraid of what my voice would do if I let it out too quickly. What I felt, sitting there, wasn't only fury at Nathaniel and Corinne, though there was plenty of that building in me already. It was recognition, cold and unwelcome, of my own part in it. Every unanswered instinct, every polite distance I'd kept because pushing closer felt like overstepping. Grace hadn't lost her friends and her money and her name all at once. She'd lost them exactly the way I'd lost my closeness with her. One reasonable-sounding excuse at a time, until neither of us noticed how much ground had disappeared beneath us. "I should have called you sooner," Grace said quietly. "I kept thinking I could fix it myself." "You didn't do this," I told her, and meant it completely. "They did. And I promise you, Grace, every single thing they took from you we are going to take back." I'd noticed the sound Nora made when she cried, thinner, more effortful than I remembered from any of the mothers' groups I used to sit through decades ago with Grace as a baby. But I hadn't let myself say the word out loud until Dr. Anita Patel, the pediatric cardiologist Callum's wife, had recommended without hesitation the moment I called, sat across from us in my own living room 2 days later with a stethoscope still around her neck and an expression I recognized from 30 years of reading people across a table. "There's a murmur," she said gently, watching Grace's face as she said it. "I'd like to get her in for an echocardiogram as soon as possible, but based on what I'm hearing, I suspect we're looking at a ventricular septal defect. A hole in the wall between the two lower chambers of the heart." Grace's hand found mine on the couch cushion between us before I even realized I'd reached for hers. How serious is that?" "Many VSDs are small and close on their own," Dr. Patel said carefully. "But some require surgical repair, and the concerning part, Mrs. Kavanaugh, is how much weight your daughter has lost in the last month. A heart working harder than it should, combined with inadequate nutrition and a cold environment for weeks at a stretch, that combination can turn a manageable condition into an urgent one very quickly. I want imaging done today, not next week." I watched something in Grace's face collapse and reassemble itself in the same instant, grief and fury arriving together, the particular expression of a mother understanding, all at once, exactly what 26 days in an unheated cottage might have cost her daughter's small, straining heart. I felt it too, sitting beside her, though I forced my voice level enough to ask the only question that mattered. "What do you need from us today to make that happen?" "A car and about 90 minutes, Dr. Patel said. "I can have the imaging center expecting us within the hour." I drove them myself. Franny stayed behind to handle the house, and I sat in the waiting room at Coastal Children's imaging with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached, listening to machines hum somewhere behind a door I wasn't allowed through, thinking about 26 nights of cold and thin crying and a diagnosis that might have come 3 weeks sooner if anyone besides Franny and me had been looking out for either of them. Callum called while we were still waiting for the results, and I stepped into the hallway to take it, grateful in a strange way, for something to focus on besides the door I was watching. "I've got the financial picture," he said without preamble, the way he always got straight to what mattered when he knew you didn't have patience left for anything else. "Grace's 11% of Doyle Maritime has been sitting in a trust since her 28th birthday, technically hers outright, but the trust documents name a co-trustee with voting authority over the shares until she formally petitions to take full control herself. Standard enough language, except the co-trustee listed is Bradley Simmons." I felt something cold settle into my chest. "My own general counsel." "Your own general counsel," Callum confirmed. "Who, as far as I can tell, has never once mentioned to you that he holds voting authority over your granddaughters. I'm sorry, your daughters, 11% stake in your own company. And Maggie, in the last 4 months, Bradley's personal financial records show 3 payments totaling just under $200,000 from a shell entity I've traced back, through 2 more shells, to Kavanaugh Holdings." I stood very still in that hallway, machines humming behind one door, my daughter and granddaughter's future being weighed in numbers behind it, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what Callum had suspected from the first phone call. This had never been only about isolating Grace out of cruelty or control for its own sake. Every quiet, reasonable thing Nathaniel and Corinne had done, the phone, the accounts, the friends, even the cottage itself, had been in service of keeping Grace disconnected and voiceless long enough for someone else to quietly vote her shares however they pleased, without her ever knowing enough to object. How much of my company can 11% voted the wrong way actually threaten? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer wouldn't be small. Combined with whatever Kavanaugh Holdings already controls indirectly through other channels, Callum said. Possibly enough to force a vote on a merger you'd never willingly agree to. I need another few days to be certain of the full picture. The imaging room door opened before I could answer him. Dr. Patel stepped out, and I turned toward her with my whole chest tight, waiting to learn which fight I needed to face first. Dr. Patel's face told me part of the answer before she said a word. The defect is moderate, not small, she said, and I don't want to sugarcoat this for either of you. Given the malnutrition and the cold exposure, her body's been compensating harder than it should have to. I'd like to get her seen by a pediatric cardiac surgeon within the week, not the month. I think surgery is likely, but I also think with proper nutrition and warmth starting today, she has every chance of coming through this well. Grace made a sound beside me that was half sob, half something closer to relief, and I put my arm around her shoulders and let her lean into me the way she hadn't since she was a teenager. And for a few minutes, standing in that hallway, I let myself feel nothing but gratitude that we'd found them at all, and fury at exactly how close 26 days had come to costing us the chance. I didn't let myself think about Bradley Simmons again until Grace and Nora were both settled back at Egret Point that evening, fed and warm, a referral to a cardiac surgeon in Charleston already scheduled for 2 days out. Then I called Doyle Maritime's chief financial officer, a woman named Patricia Ostrander I trusted nearly as much as I trusted Callum, and asked her to have Bradley in the boardroom at 8 the next morning. No explanation given, no advance warning. He walked in at 7:58, 2 minutes early the way he'd always been in 11 years working for me, wearing the same easy, competent smile he wore into every room, and I watched that smile falter, just slightly, when he saw Callum Reed already seated at the far end of the table with a folder in front of him. "Maggie," Bradley said. "Is everything all right?" "Sit down, Bradley," I told him, and I kept my voice exactly as level as I keep it during quarterly earnings calls, because I had promised myself the night before that whatever fury I felt toward this man, he would hear it from me in full sentences, not in shouting. "I want to talk to you about a trust document. The one naming you co-trustee over my daughter's 11% stake in this company." To his credit, or perhaps simply because he understood immediately there was no version of denial that would survive the room, Bradley didn't try to claim ignorance. He sat down slowly, folded his hands on the table and said, "I can explain the structure of that arrangement if you'll let me." "You have exactly one chance to explain it honestly," I said, "before Callum reads this room 3 payments totaling just under $200,000, routed through 2 shell entities back to Kavanaugh Holdings, and after that, whatever you say won't matter nearly as much as what a federal prosecutor decides to do with it." I watched something in his face go gray. Bradley Simmons had drafted my company's bylaws. He had sat beside me at my husband's funeral 14 years ago, had handled every sensitive piece of legal business Doyle Maritime had touched since before Grace was old enough to understand what her mother did for a living, and I understood, watching him fold under the weight of what I'd just said, that whatever loyalty I'd believed existed between us had been for sale for less than a fifth of what my company was worth. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he finally said quietly. "Corinne approached me 8 months ago, before Grace's wedding, even while the trust documents were still being drafted. She framed it as protecting the family's interests, making sure the shares wouldn't be mismanaged by someone inexperienced. I told myself I was just structuring standard fiduciary language. I didn't know about the cottage, Maggie. I want you to believe that much, at least. I never once imagined they'd go that far with Grace herself. You knew enough, I told him, to structure a trust that stripped my daughter of voting control over her own inheritance, and to accept payment from the very family benefiting from it, and never once mention any of it to me in 8 months of sitting across this table from me. Whatever you didn't know about the cottage doesn't undo what you did know. I suspended him from the board that morning, effective immediately, pending a full internal investigation and, I told him plainly, likely referral to federal authorities given the scale of what Callum had already documented. He didn't argue. He gathered the folder in front of him with hands that weren't entirely steady, and at the door he turned back once. "For what it's worth," he said. "I am sorry. Genuinely. It isn't worth very much," I told him, "but I'll let a judge decide exactly how little." When the door closed behind him, Callum looked at me across the long table and said quietly, "Now we know how deep it goes on our side. I think it's time you called Senator Walsh. No. Senator Bennett. Louise Bennett. I think it's time." Grace found me in the study a little after Bradley left, Nora asleep against her shoulder in the sling Franny had dug out of storage from Grace's own infancy, and she stood in the doorway a long moment before she spoke, the way she does when she's working up to something she's been holding on to. "I need to tell you something I haven't told you yet," she said. "I have a phone." I looked up from the papers Callum had left spread across my desk. "I thought Nathaniel took your phone." "He took the one he gave me," Grace said. "This is a different one." She came in and sat across from me, shifting Nora carefully as she did. About 6 weeks in, before things got as bad as they got, I started to understand something was wrong. Not the full shape of it, not yet, but enough that some part of me started keeping a record without fully admitting to myself why. I used part of the last cash I had before Nathaniel took over the accounts and bought a prepaid phone at a drugstore in town, one of the rare times he let me leave the property with him. I kept it hidden in the lining of Nora's diaper bag. In a slit I sewed myself with a sewing kit I found in the cottage. I only turned it on a handful of times, when I was sure I was alone. She reached into the diaper bag sitting beside her chair, and worked her fingers along the inside seam until she found what she was looking for. A small black phone, scratched, battery clearly low, the kind of device you'd walk past in a store without a second look. "There's a recording on there," she said. 38 minutes. I made it about 10 days before you found me. The one time I overheard Nathaniel and Corinne together in the main house, close enough to the window that I could hear most of it. I'd walked up from the cottage that evening because Nora had a fever and I was desperate enough to risk it, to ask them for help. I stood outside the study window trying to work up the nerve to knock, and instead I heard them talking, and I understood, standing there in the dark with a sick baby in my arms, that knocking would have been a mistake. I took the phone from her carefully, the way you'd take something that might shatter, and asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether she was ready to let me hear it. She nodded, and I plugged it into a charger from my desk drawer while it built enough battery to play, and the two of us sat in near silence for the 20 minutes it took, Grace's hand tight around mine the whole time. What came through the recording, once it finally started, was worse than I had let myself imagine. Corinne's voice first, clipped and businesslike in a register I recognized from every gala and charity board I'd ever sat across from her at, discussing the trust timeline and Simmons' cooperation with the same tone she might use to discuss catering for a fundraiser. Nathaniel's voice next, more hesitant than I expected, at one point asking whether this had gone further than they'd planned, and Corinne's answer, flat and immediate. "It goes exactly as far as it needs to. She stays out there until the vote is secure. After that, it's not our problem what she decides to do." There was a stretch near the 14-minute mark where Nathaniel asked directly about the baby's health, and Corinne's response, that Grace was dramatic about it, and that the doctor at the retreat can handle whatever comes up if it actually becomes necessary, made my hands go cold around the edge of my desk because there was no doctor, and both of them clearly knew it. By the time the recording reached its final minutes, discussing a target date for finalizing the Doyle position, ahead of a shareholder vote scheduled for early the following month, I understood we weren't looking at a family dispute or even simple corporate greed anymore. We were looking at a documented, deliberate conspiracy to seize control of my company by holding my daughter and granddaughter's well-being hostage to it. I sat back in my chair once the recording ended, and Grace looked at me with an expression somewhere between exhausted and fierce. "I didn't know if it would matter," she said. "I just knew I needed proof in case no one believed me later." "It matters," I told her. "It matters more than almost anything else we have." I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in nearly 2 years, since a fundraiser dinner where Louise Bennett and I had spent most of the evening trading stories about running organizations men kept underestimating. I think it's time we brought this to someone who can actually do something with it beyond this room. Louise picked up on the third ring, warm and brisk the way she always was, and I said only, "Louise, it's Maggie Doyle. I need an hour of your time, and I need you to bring someone from the Justice Department contacts you're always joking about knowing personally. This isn't a joke anymore." Louise Bennett arrived at Egret Point 2 hours later with a woman named Deborah Ashcroft in tow, a federal prosecutor from the Justice Department's Charleston office, who Louise introduced simply as someone who's been building a securities fraud case for longer than you'd believe, and who I suspect has been waiting for exactly the piece you're about to hand her. Deborah listened to the recording twice, took Callum's financial documentation in a folder thick enough to need both hands, and asked more precise, careful questions than I'd expected from anyone outside a courtroom. How the phone had been obtained, whether Grace had been coerced or influenced in making it, whether Callum's chain of custody on the financial records would hold up to scrutiny. By the time she finished, close to midnight, her expression had shifted from professional interest to something sharper. "This isn't just enough to open an investigation," she said. "Combined with what my office already has on Kavanaugh Holdings' trading patterns over the last 6 months, this may be enough to move fast. There's a gala Friday night at the Featherstone Hotel in Charleston, Kavanaugh Holdings' annual founders event, 400 guests, most of the board, most of your remaining major shareholders. If Corinne and Nathaniel believe the shareholder vote is still secure, I'd expect them to use that stage to announce it publicly, the way people in their world tend to do when they think they've already won." "Then that's where we go," I said. Deborah studied me a long moment. "I need to be clear about something, Mrs. Doyle. If we move on this at the gala, it happens on federal timing, not personal timing. My agents make the decisions about when and how anyone is approached. You and your daughter would be there as witnesses, not as the ones executing anything." "Understood," I told her, though I noticed Grace, sitting beside me with Nora finally asleep in her lap, had a look on her face that told me she had her own plans for exactly how present she intended to be. Friday came faster than I expected it to. Grace insisted on attending herself, over my initial objection and Franny's louder one, and in the end I understood I had no real grounds to refuse her. This had happened to her, not only to the company, and she had earned 26 cold nights over, the right to walk back into that world on her own terms rather than hide from it. We arrived at the Featherstone a little after 8. Grace in a simple dark green dress. Franny had helped her into that afternoon, steadier on her feet than I'd seen her since Port Callaway, though I could feel the tension radiating off her the whole car ride over. Deborah's agents were already inside, dispersed quietly among catering staff and a handful of guests I hadn't been told to expect, and Callum walked one pace behind us the entire evening, close enough to matter, far enough not to draw attention. Nathaniel saw us first, near the champagne table, and I watched every trace of color leave his face in the span of about 2 seconds. Corinne noticed a moment later from across the ballroom, and unlike her son, she recovered her composure almost instantly, gliding toward us with a smile so practiced I nearly admired it, if I hadn't known exactly what it was covering. "Maggie," she said, warm as ever. "And Grace, darling, you look wonderful. We'd heard you were recovering somewhere quiet." "I was," Grace said, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in weeks. "You made sure of that." The orchestra had just finished a set, and Nathaniel, perhaps sensing the only way to control the room was to seize it first, moved toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, tapping the microphone with the forced brightness of a man trying to outrun something. "If everyone could give me just a moment," he began. "I have some exciting news to share about the future of Kavanaugh Holdings." Grace was already moving before I could stop her, and I understood, watching her cross that ballroom floor in front of 400 stunned guests, that stopping her had never actually been an option I had. She reached the edge of the stage and spoke clearly enough that the microphone caught every word. "Before you share your exciting news, Nathaniel, I think this room deserves to know where your wife and daughter actually were for the last month. Not a wellness retreat. A cottage on Marsh Row with no heat, no phone, and no money, while you and your mother worked out exactly how to steal my shares in my mother's company." The room went entirely silent, the particular silence of 400 people simultaneously realizing they are watching something they were never supposed to see. Nathaniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again with no sound coming out. Corinne's composure finally, visibly cracked. Deborah's agents moved at exactly that moment, calm and unhurried. Two of them reaching Corinne's side before she'd fully processed what was happening, another approaching the stage where Nathaniel stood frozen at the microphone. I heard someone near me gasp the word "federal agents" into a stunned silence that had already been broken wide open. I found Grace's hand as she stepped back from the stage and held it tightly, watching Corinne Kavanagh, for the first time in 18 months, look genuinely, completely powerless. The gala didn't end so much as dissolve. Waiters standing frozen with trays of champagne no one was drinking anymore. Guests clustering in low, urgent conversation near the exits. A stunned string quartet still holding their instruments though no one had told them to stop playing or given them any reason to start again. I stood near the edge of the stage with Grace's hand still locked in mine, watching federal agents lead Corinne Kavanagh out through a side door with a composure that had finally, entirely abandoned her. Her face white and furious and, for the first time since I'd known her, completely without a script. Nathaniel didn't resist when they approached him. He simply stood at the microphone a moment longer, looking out at 400 people who had, until 90 seconds earlier, believed him to be exactly what he'd always presented himself as, and I watched something in his posture collapse under the weight of that recognition before an agent took his arm and walked him from the stage. Deborah Ashcroft found us near the coat check 20 minutes later. Her expression carefully professional but not unkind. "This is going to move quickly now," she told us. "Securities fraud, wire fraud, likely several counts related to the trust structure and Bradley Simmons' cooperation with them. I'll need formal statements from both of you this week, but Mrs. Kavanagh, Grace, what you did tonight, walking into that room yourself, that took considerable courage. I want you to know it matters, beyond the legal case." Grace nodded, and I felt the last of the tension finally leave her hand in mine, replaced by something quieter and more exhausted, the particular fatigue of a person who has just set down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd nearly forgotten what her arms felt like without it. The days that followed moved the way I imagine most reckonings do once the dramatic part is over. Slower, more procedural, less satisfying in the moment than the gala itself but more permanent in what they actually built. Bradley Simmons, facing the weight of Callum's documentation and Deborah's case, agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence, which gave prosecutors the internal paper trail they needed to move on Nathaniel and Corinne with real speed. Kavanagh Holdings Board, scrambling to distance itself from its own founders, voted within 2 weeks to formally sever the trust arrangement over Grace's shares, restoring her full and unquestioned control over her own inheritance, effective immediately. I never did find out exactly what became of the wellness retreat story once the truth came out publicly, though I heard secondhand that several of Corinne's oldest friends stopped returning her calls the same week the story broke in the Charleston papers. Nora's surgery took place 11 days after the gala, at a children's hospital in Charleston that Dr. Patel trusted completely, and I have never, in 63 years, sat through a longer 4 hours than the ones Grace and I spent in that waiting room. Her hand in mine again, neither of us speaking much because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in some form over the previous weeks. When the surgeon finally came out, still in scrubs, and told us the repair had gone exactly as well as they'd hoped, Grace made the same sound she'd made in that market parking lot weeks earlier. Except this time it wasn't grief. I held my daughter while she cried from relief instead of fear, and I understood, standing there, that this was the moment I'd actually been fighting for the whole time, more than any boardroom vote or federal indictment. A small heart mended. A family, still whole enough to mend around it. Grace and Nora stayed at Egret Point through the winter, longer than either of us had originally planned, and I found I didn't want to rush her toward independence the way some old instinct in me might once have insisted was the respectful thing to do. We took walks along the marsh most mornings, Nora bundled against the cold in a stroller Franny had bought before either of us thought to ask, and Grace talked slowly about small things at first. A book she was reading, a friend from college she'd finally worked up the nerve to call again, before eventually talking about harder things, the cottage, the fear, the strange way she'd started doubting her own memory before she ever doubted Nathaniel's intentions. I told her, one of those mornings, The thing I'd been turning over since that first night in the rental car outside the market. I spent 30 years building a company by trusting numbers over instinct, I said. And I told myself with you that giving you space was the same thing as respecting you. It wasn't. It was me, avoiding my own fear of getting it wrong, and calling it something nobler. Grace was quiet a moment, watching Nora reach for a marsh reed just out of her grasp. I don't think either of us knew how to ask for help, she finally said. Maybe that's the thing we actually have to fix, not just what they did to us. She was right, and I have tried every day since to be the kind of mother who asks the harder question rather than the comfortable one. I learned that love without vigilance is only good intentions, and that the space I'd given my daughter for 18 months hadn't been a gift at all. It had been my own fear, dressed up as respect. What I gained in the end wasn't just Grace's safety or Nora's mended heart or even the company I'd spent 30 years building. It was a daughter who finally believed she could tell me the truth, and a mother who finally understood that showing up loudly and often was never the same thing as overstepping.